Hello everybody, my name is Kara, and today I'm here with a review for By Felipe, Disses, Dick Pics, and Other Delights of Modern Dating by Alexandra Tweten. I received a free review copy from the publicist in exchange for an honest review. So as you can probably gather from the title, this book is a nonfiction, and it's about basically the difficulties and the stresses and the dangers of being a woman on the internet. It does address kind of the modern dating world and dating apps in particular, but I do think that this book is applicable to basically anyone on the internet who's not a cis man. Like, I personally am not super involved in online dating, but I still found a lot in this book that was very relevant to my experience on the internet. I also want to point out, in case you are worried by the title, there are not actually any dick pics in this book, so thank the Lord. So you don't need to worry about being subjected to these if you decide to pick up the book. I also think that this book overall is just a really good resource for any woman or non-binary person on the internet who wants to feel seen and who wants to kind of learn more about the statistics and the occurrences of this on the internet. But I also think this would be a great book for men who maybe don't understand what it's like for the rest of us, or even who do but want a clearer picture of some of the things that can happen just on an everyday basis that really shouldn't be happening at all. Also, a quick note, the By Felipe is a reference to By Felicia. So that was basically the male equivalent that the author of this book came up with and started using on social media as kind of a dismissive way to kind of get past some of the offensive messages and things that men did on the internet that she came across. So first I'm going to talk about the things I really liked about this book. Then there are a couple of things that I thought were good but could have been better, and then there are a couple of things that I think this book did not do very well. So first off, I think that the whole book in general did a really good job of balancing humor and kind of the horror of what goes on the internet every day. And the author kind of addresses this at the beginning, that there are some times where things happen where you either have to cry or laugh, and she chose to laugh at some of them. But with that being said, I do think that she addressed some of the really serious safety issues later on in the book. I think that it balanced those two things really well. It's like women can kind of come together and like laugh at some of these ridiculous messages, but she also does a good job of pointing out that as a whole, this trend is not a laughing matter. I mean, some of the alliterative names she uses for the types of boys on these dating apps or online, some of those are a little bit cutesy, but I think that overall the tone was handled really well. They use actual messages that real people have received from men on the internet, and quite a few of them are just horrifying. Like, they kind of make you feel like you need to go take a shower after reading them because they are so despicable and dehumanizing, and the things that these men have threatened women with, or that they say they deserve because they dared to not want to go out with them on a date, it's pretty terrifying. And I mean, it's not always comfortable to read some of these interactions, but I think that it's important that we are aware of how often these things happen and how these are not, like, the really bad ones are not exceptions. You know, like, it's not like every once in a while somebody will run across a really bad and violent example. It's like, this is the norm. And that's just unacceptable. I also think that the examples she used and the way she talked about them did a good job of communicating the kind of all-consuming fear that a lot of us go through on the internet, because even if you don't receive these messages every day, you know that it's always a possibility and it's probably going to happen at some point, just statistically. And also the fact that you never know which of them are going to turn out to be the really dangerous ones, you know? Like, I know some people say that, oh, just write it off, you know, it was one guy who was kind of being a jerk and you, like, don't worry about it. But the problem is that you never actually know which of those are going to be harmless, you know, although I would argue that any of these are not harmless because you are objectifying someone and you're treating them in a really disgusting way. But you never know which of these are going to be the really dangerous ones that can turn into a stalker situation or any of this. Like, you never know. So you have to kind of approach all of them like they could be extremely dangerous. I also really like the fact that the author used specific instructions and statistics. Like, she doesn't just say, oh, it's important to be safe on the internet. She has, like, step by step, here's how to safeguard your account by using a different picture that you've never used before because of reverse image search and things like that. So I really like that it wasn't just kind of vague, it's important to be safe and to keep your personal information private. Like, she had actionable things that people could do on the internet in order to protect themselves and steps to take if something went wrong along the way. And I really, really liked that. I don't think that's something that we see enough of, is like tangible things that you can do to prevent this or to address it once it has happened. And by it, I mean like sexual harassment online, or even when things escalate further. Like, for example, she talked about the importance of filing a restraining order if things go too far, and I really like what she said because she pointed out that even if you don't think this stalking aspect is applicable, or even if you think it's not going to do anything, it's really important to take a step like that because it sort of legitimizes your claim for the law, so that as you kind of make this case against this person who is threatening you, harassing you, abusing you, whatever, that you have done kind of all of the things that you were supposed to do, and that makes your claim more likely to be acted upon by law enforcement. I also think the author did a pretty good job of using inclusive language throughout the book. Like, she specifically says women, non-binary people, femme people. I think overall she was very inclusive as far as gender identity when she was talking about experiences on the internet and how those differ for different groups of people. I think that the book overall is a pretty good approach to kind of the basics of feminism. And actually, as I started reading the book, I felt like it was maybe a little too basic in the way that it approached feminist topics, but I realized that actually that's one of the strengths of the book, because people might be picking this up who don't really have any idea of what it's like to be a woman or a non-binary person on the internet, and I think actually that's a good thing that this book kind of starts out from a very basic place, and as you go on, I think she gets more into the nitty-gritty of feminism and things that I guess aren't so entry level. So now moving into the things that are kind of a plus-minus situation where I think they were good but could have been better. Unfortunately, the intersectionality of race and gender she didn't really address as much. There was a very, very short section that did address the fact that it is even more difficult for people of color on the internet, but I really think she should have been more specific about it and incorporated that more throughout the book. Maybe even had a whole chapter on that. As far as I know, the author is a white woman, and I don't know if she felt maybe like she couldn't speak on that topic, which is totally fair and valid and probably correct, but I think if that was the case, she could have made the effort to seek out a colleague who was a person of color who could have spoken on that better. So I think even though something is better than nothing, I think that she could have gone farther with that. I don't know if maybe she just didn't want to bring in somebody to write an extra chapter who wasn't herself, or maybe like the publisher didn't want her to do that. I don't know what the reasons were, but I think that the book could have benefited from another perspective like that. I also want to talk about the formatting. So you do get a lot of the actual messages themselves along with some commentary or kind of who submitted the exchange. Overall, I think this is formatted really well, but my only gripe with that is that there were a couple of places where it was hard to tell which description went with which message that they included. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the things that I think were not a success. So one of them is kind of this just ask for it attitude that she gets into at the end of the book when she's talking about confidence and women having confidence, and there's a quotation that inspired this, I think, that was like basically have the confidence of a basic straight white man or something like that. And the author kind of takes that as like a get out and just ask for what you deserve, and kind of a call to arms to just ask for what you want, you know? And I feel like in theory that's a good idea, and I think in a lot of cases we could stand to take that attitude on, but there are some times where it's like, if you just like storm into your boss's office and demand the raise that you know you deserve, like you're gonna get fired. You know, you're not gonna get a raise. I think she could have been a little more, I don't know, a little more understanding of the like systemic issues and also just the personal issues that would maybe prevent that from being applicable across the board. Like, it's a nice idea, but I don't think she handled it with as much like nuance as she did some other topics in the book. And kind of going along with that, she talks about this one experience she had where she dated somebody who she knew even at the time that like it wasn't going to work out. He was stringing her along. He was kind of emotionally, I don't want to say emotionally abusing her. I don't remember if she used that term, but like he was not a good person and he was not treating her well. And she talks about that that experience, and she kind of uses it as like sometimes you just have to date the bad ones to grow as a person. And she doesn't say that, like she doesn't tell people you should date someone you know doesn't treat you well in order to grow. But it did kind of come across as like she was happy that this had happened, and that kind of bothered me a little bit because yes, sometimes experiences with people, whether they are romantic relationships or friendships, sometimes those experiences that are negative overall can still help you get to know yourself better and to like kind of grow in your confidence and your self-worth. But I think a lot of times that's not the case, and it's like she didn't really take into consideration that like some people who date one of these end up as murder victims or in an abusive relationship, or there's so many other ways that that can play out that I think she didn't take into consideration, which I thought was especially weird because, again, in earlier chapters, I felt like she handled the darkest examples of these interactions or relationships really well, so like that was kind of strange. Also, this is like completely personal preference, but there were a couple of places where I felt like she used examples that were not, I don't know, were not ethical. Like she talked about how like all the many ways that you can use Tinder, and it's not just a dating app anymore. And she said that she has a friend who is using it to fuck his way to the top, I think is the expression that she used. And that personally just doesn't sit right with me because, like, basically this idea that he was not getting promoted based on competency. It was just like he had sex with the right person. And I feel like that's kind of a weird double standard to have, where it's like we look down on women who do that, and actually we have all these stereotypes about like secretaries and like, oh, they're sleeping with the boss in order to get a promotion. So that's how we think of women who do that, but for men who do that, it's like, oh, good for you, man, like getting what's yours. So I just thought that was kind of weird and like a strange thing to throw in there because it was sort of a one-off comment, and I was like, why would you bring this into the book? Because by including it in this list of ways you can use Tinder that is not just dating, it kind of sounded like she was in support of it, or like that she was recommending people use it for that purpose, even though it wasn't her personally, it was a friend, and like she didn't come out and say like that this was a good thing to do, but I just thought that was really strange. So even with those last few things that I do think could have been handled better, I did enjoy this book overall. I think it was a really good discussion of this issue, and it had a lot of concrete details and a lot of specific recommendations and analysis, and actually she gets into some like response like survey statistics, and she comes right out and says like, you know, she's not trained in this, but kind of the conclusions you can draw from this that are just sort of logical, and I thought that was really well done. So I do think this is a really important book. I think if you're a person who has experienced this kind of harassment on the internet, which is unfortunately most of us, I think it would be great for you, and I also think it would be great just for everybody to read, to really understand what women and non-binary people experience on the internet on a day-to-day basis a lot of times, or at least there's like that constant threat that it could happen. So altogether, I gave By Felipe 4 stars, and I would recommend it. So let me know what you all thought of this book, if you have read it, or if you're planning to pick it up. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!